The call came at 2:47 in the morning, ripping Cole Thompson from a dream he'd never remember. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah, his ex-wife, and it was a sound he'd never heard before. Pure, animal terror. They took her, Cole. Oh God, they took Lily. The phone nearly slipped from his hand as the words registered, each syllable hitting him like a physical blow. His 8-year-old daughter, the only light left in his dark world, had been sleeping at her mother's house in Scottsdale just hours earlier, safe in her bed, surrounded by stuffed animals and drawings she'd made at school. Now she was gone, taken by men with guns and accents, according to Sarah's hysterical account between sobs that made his chest feel like it was caving in. They'd kicked down the back door at 2:15 a.m., Sarah managed to explain through her panic. 3 men, maybe 4, wearing masks and moving with military precision. She'd heard Lily scream, had run toward her daughter's room, but they'd shoved her against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. By the time she'd gotten up, they were gone, and all that remained was Lily's favorite unicorn clutched on the floor and a Polaroid photograph left deliberately on the kitchen table. Cole's hands shook as Sarah described the image. Lily, still in her pink unicorn pajamas, sitting in a concrete room with tears streaming down her face and terror in her eyes that no 8-year-old should ever know. The message scrawled on the back was in Spanish, but Cole understood it perfectly even before Sarah read it to him in a breaking voice. You took from us. Now we take from you. Águila Cartel never forgets. Call the police and she dies screaming. Cole Razor Thompson had spent 18 years earning his road name in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The nickname came from his precision during the club's more violent operations, his ability to cut through problems with surgical accuracy while others panicked and made mistakes that got people killed or sent to prison. He'd built the Phoenix chapter from 20 struggling members to 97 of the toughest, most loyal brothers in the Southwest. He'd survived 3 federal investigations that had sent dozens of other angels to prison, 2 assassination attempts by rival clubs that should have killed him, and a divorce that nearly destroyed him in ways that bullets never could. He'd done things he wasn't proud of, had blood on his hands that no amount of whiskey could wash away, had made choices that haunted his dreams on the rare nights when sleep actually came. But none of that mattered now. None of his reputation or his power or his carefully constructed life meant anything at all. His hands shook as he stared at the photo Sarah had texted him, at Lily's terrified eyes staring back at him through the digital image. Those same eyes that lit up every other Friday when he picked her up for their weekend together. The same little girl who'd drawn him a picture last month of the 2 of them riding his motorcycle together, with a big red heart and the words "Best Daddy Ever" written in crayon. The cartel thought they were sending a message about territory, about respect, about the drug shipment the Angels had intercepted 3 weeks earlier on Interstate 10. They thought this was about business, about the $4 million in heroin that was now sitting in a federal evidence locker. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a man who would burn the entire world to ashes to get his daughter back. They'd made the fatal mistake of believing that criminals didn't love their children as fiercely as anyone else. If you're ready to witness how far a father will go when his innocent child is threatened, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will take you into the darkest corners of vengeance, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood that define the outlaw world. The next 24 hours would reshape the criminal landscape of the entire Southwest and leave a trail of destruction that law enforcement is still trying to piece together today. This is a story about what happens when you cross the one line that should never be crossed, when you threaten the family of a man who has nothing left to lose and an army of brothers willing to ride into hell itself at his command. Raphael Mendoza, known throughout the cartel world as El Coyote for his cunning and survival instincts, had made what he believed was a calculated move based on months of surveillance and planning. The Hells Angels had cost the Águila Cartel nearly $4 million when they intercepted that heroin shipment on Interstate 10 3 weeks ago, and Raphael's boss, the mysterious and terrifying figure known only as El Patron, had made it absolutely clear that someone would pay with blood for that loss. But Raphael's motivations went deeper than simple business or following orders. His younger brother Carlos had been driving one of those trucks when the Angels set up their ambush. When the convoy was hit, Carlos had panicked and swerved off the highway, crashing his semi-truck into a ravine at 70 miles per hour. Now he was in a hospital in Hermosillo, clinging to life with a fractured skull, a collapsed lung, broken ribs that had punctured internal organs, and brain damage that the doctors said would leave him permanently disabled even if he survived. Raphael had studied Cole Thompson for weeks after the ambush, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, the cracks in his armor. He knew about the divorce 2 years ago, knew that Thompson's ex-wife had gotten full custody because of his criminal lifestyle. He knew that Cole saw his daughter every other weekend, that he'd moved into a smaller apartment to afford the child support payments, that he'd actually tried to distance himself from some of the club's more violent activities to prove to the courts that he could be a better father. What Raphael didn't know, what he couldn't have known from surveillance photos and informant reports, was that Lily wasn't just Thompson's daughter in the legal sense. She was the reason Cole had tried to go legitimate 2 years ago, the reason he'd almost walked away from the club entirely. She was his redemption, his second chance at being the man he'd always wanted to be, his everything. Taking her wasn't just a tactical move. It was the one thing guaranteed to unleash something Raphael's careful planning hadn't accounted for. Within 30 minutes of that phone call that shattered his world, every Hells Angels chapter from Los Angeles to Albuquerque received an emergency alert that would bring the entire Southwest to its knees. The message was simple, coded, and absolute. Code Black. Razor's daughter taken, 8 years old, all debts called in, all favors due, ride or die. In the outlaw motorcycle world, Code Black meant only one thing. A member's family had been attacked, and the entire brotherhood was expected to respond with overwhelming force. Cole's phone exploded with responses before he could even process what he needed to do next. Tommy Reaper Sullivan, his vice president and closest friend since they were prospects together 18 years ago, was already on his Harley racing from Tucson, his message simple and fierce. "On my way, brother. We'll get her back." Jake Madman Chen, their road captain in Los Angeles and a former Marine who'd served 3 tours in Iraq, had mobilized 40 brothers before the sun came up, his text reading, "LA chapter rolling out. ETA 4 hours. Nobody touches our family." Even retired members, men who'd hung up their colors years ago to avoid prison or because age had finally caught up with them, were dusting off their leather cuts and checking weapons they'd sworn they'd never touch again. Marcus Bulldog Patterson called from Nevada, 68 years old with emphysema, his voice gravelly but determined. "I'm too old to ride, Razor, but I can still shoot. Tell me where and when." Vincent Snake Rodriguez texted from New Mexico with a photo of 15 bikers already on the road. "Albuquerque chapter en route. We ride for Lily." The cartel had attacked family, had threatened a child, and in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, that meant only one response was possible: total, absolute, unforgiving war. The kind of war that would end with either Lily back in her father's arms or every single member of the Aguila cartel in body bags. Lily Thompson sat on a cold concrete floor in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, hugging her knees to her chest and trying to remember the breathing exercises her school counselor had taught her for when she felt anxious. She'd stopped crying an hour ago, not because she wasn't scared anymore, but because she'd run out of tears and her throat hurt from sobbing. The men who'd taken her spoke in rapid Spanish, occasionally glancing at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Some looked angry, some looked nervous, and one of the younger ones kept looking away quickly whenever their eyes met, like he felt bad about what they were doing. Raphael paced the warehouse constantly, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed tones that grew more agitated with each call. She caught fragments of conversation even though she didn't speak Spanish. "El Patron wants proof. Make the father understand. Keep her alive for now. We need to show them we're serious." Lily had inherited her father's intelligence and her mother's strength. even if she was only 8 years old. Even through her terror, even though she wanted to cry and scream and call for her daddy, she noticed things. The warehouse had 3 exits that she could see: a main rolling door, a regular door on the side, and what looked like an emergency exit in the back. There were 7 men total guarding her, but only 3 carried guns openly, while the others had knives or just seemed to be watching. The youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, kept looking at her with something that might have been guilt or regret. She remembered what her father had told her during their last visit when they'd watched an action movie together. "If you're ever in trouble, baby girl, stay smart and stay strong. Notice everything. Remember everything. I'll always find you. No matter what, I'll always come for you. That's a promise, and Daddy never breaks his promises to you." The first strike came at dawn, painting the Arizona sky orange and red as the Outlaw cartel's money laundering operation in Mesa went up in flames that could be seen for miles. $2 million in cash that had been waiting to be cleaned through legitimate businesses burned hot enough to melt the steel beams of the warehouse. No one was killed in the blast. The building had been empty when the charges went off at exactly 6 a.m., but the message was unmistakable and terrifying in its precision. Cole stood on a hill 3 miles away, watching the smoke rise into the morning sky, his phone pressed to his ear while coordinating multiple operations simultaneously. "Phase 1 complete," came Tommy's voice from Tucson, satisfaction evident even through the digital connection. Their cocaine processing lab just had a very bad morning. Buildings gone. Products gone. 3 vehicles destroyed. Nobody killed, but they got the message. Jake's voice crackled through from Los Angeles on another line that Cole had running through a Bluetooth earpiece. "Their weapons cache in Carson is now a smoking crater. A TF is going to have questions, but by the time they figure out what happened, we'll have Lily back." A third call came through from Marcus in Nevada. "Their distribution center just lost about 6 months of inventory. Fire department saying it'll burn for hours." Cole felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory or revenge. Only cold, focused purpose that pushed away the terror threatening to overwhelm him every time he thought about Lily scared and alone. Each destroyed operation was a message written in fire and steel that anyone with eyes could read. Return his daughter unharmed, or watch everything they'd built for generations turn to ash. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't making threats. He was simply demonstrating what would happen, operation by operation, hour by hour, until his daughter was back in his arms. Raphael's confidence began to crack like thin ice over deep water as reports flooded in from across the Southwest. In 6 hours, the Hells Angels had hit 9 cartel operations across 5 states with military precision that would have impressed actual military commanders. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, couldn't stop ringing, each call bringing worse news than the last. Lieutenants from Phoenix, Tucson, El Paso, Albuquerque, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and even Tijuana were all reporting simultaneous attacks on their operations. Warehouses burning, money gone, product destroyed, vehicles blown up, and worst of all, not a single casualty to give them someone to retaliate against. "It's impossible," Raphael told Carlos over the phone, standing at his brother's hospital bedside and watching machines keep him alive. "Bikers don't move this fast. They don't have this kind of coordination. They don't have the resources for something like this." But Carlos, barely conscious and speaking through broken teeth and a jaw wired shut, managed 4 words that chilled Raphael's blood more than any threat could have. "You took his daughter." The younger Mendoza brother had seen enough violence in his years with the cartel to recognize the truth that his older brother was refusing to face. They hadn't just attacked a criminal organization that could be intimidated or negotiated with. They'd awakened something far more dangerous than any cartel, something primal and unstoppable that operated on different rules than the business of drugs and money. They'd threatened a father's child, had made that father believe his daughter might die. and now they would pay a price that no amount of money or power could cover. Cole's ex-wife Sarah sat in a federal safe house on the outskirts of Phoenix, surrounded by FBI agents who'd arrived within 2 hours of Lily's kidnapping. The house was nondescript, a suburban rental that looked like every other house on the block, but inside it was equipped with surveillance equipment, reinforced doors, and enough firepower to hold off a small army. Agent Maria Rodriguez, a veteran of cartel investigations who'd spent 15 years working the border, had been trying to convince Cole to let the authorities handle the situation since she'd arrived. "We have protocols for this, Mr. Thompson," she'd said in that calm, professional voice that law enforcement officers use when they're trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. "We have resources, trained negotiators, relationships with Mexican authorities. We can bring your daughter home safely without anyone else getting hurt, but you need to stand down and let us do our job." But Cole had looked at her with eyes that had gone dead inside, eyes that Sarah recognized from their worst fights during the marriage, and said something that made the veteran agent actually step back. "You have 24 hours to find her, Agent Rodriguez. 24 hours to use your protocols and your resources and your relationships. After that, I'm not leaving anyone alive to prosecute. After that, I'm going to kill every single person who was involved in taking my daughter, and I'm going to make sure they suffer before they die. So I suggest you work fast because I'm not bluffing, and I'm not going to stop until either Lily is home or I'm dead." The way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, made it clear this wasn't a threat or negotiating position. It was a simple statement of fact, a promise carved in stone. Sarah had never seen that version of her ex-husband before, not in the 10 years they'd been together. She'd married Cole Thompson before he became Razor, before the Hells Angels consumed his entire life and turned him into someone she barely recognized. She'd fallen in love with a mechanic who rode motorcycles on weekends and made her laugh, who'd been gentle and kind and talked about opening his own shop someday. She'd left him when the club became more important than their marriage, when the late nights and the violence and the constant fear that he'd end up dead or in prison became too much to bear. But now, watching him coordinate a military-style campaign of destruction from their dining room table, making calls and sending texts and moving pieces on a map like some kind of general planning a war, she understood something she'd never fully grasped before. This was who he really was underneath everything else, not the mechanic or the husband or even the biker. This was a father who would tear the world apart for his child. The map, spread across the dining room table, was covered in red markers indicating cartel operations, with black X's crossing out each one as it was destroyed. Sarah counted 15 X's in just 8 hours. 15 targets hit with such precision that even Agent Rodriguez had stopped trying to convince Cole to stand down and had started coordinating with her own people to track the chaos spreading across 5 states. "How did you even know where all these places were?" the agent had asked at one point, genuine professional curiosity breaking through her carefully maintained neutral expression. Cole had smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held no warmth at all. "We've been watching them for years, Agent Rodriguez. The Angels don't just ride around looking tough. We gather intelligence. We plan. We prepare. And when someone crosses the line like this, we execute." Lily had been counting everything she could to keep her mind focused and push away the terror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. 9 men had been in the warehouse when she first arrived in the pre-dawn darkness. Now only 6 remained, and their mood had changed dramatically from confident to increasingly panicked. The others had been called away to deal with emergencies that the remaining guards discussed in rapid Spanish that grew louder and more agitated with each passing hour. She'd heard them mention fires, explosions, arrests, millions of dollars lost. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the fear in their voices. The young guard who'd looked guilty earlier now seemed absolutely terrified, constantly checking his phone with shaking hands and glancing toward the exits like he was thinking about running away. He'd brought her a bottle of water and a granola bar an hour ago, setting them down near her without making eye contact, and she'd heard him mutter something that might have been an apology. Raphael's demeanor had changed, too, transformed completely from the confident cartel lieutenant who'd orchestrated her kidnapping. His swagger had been replaced by frantic pacing and shouted phone calls where he kept having to repeat himself and explain things to someone who was clearly very angry with him. She'd watched him throw his phone against the wall twice, watched him grab one of his men by the shirt and scream in his face about incompetence and failure. Despite her fear, despite the fact that she was only 8 years old and trapped in a warehouse with dangerous criminals, Lily felt something else growing inside her alongside the terror. Pride. Her father wasn't just coming for her like he'd promised. He was tearing apart the entire organization that had taken her, piece by piece, operation by operation. She'd heard him tell stories about the club, about brotherhood and loyalty and what it meant to be a Hell's Angel. Now she understood what those words really meant, understood the power of having people who would ride through hell itself for family. The call came at sunset, exactly 18 hours after Lily's kidnapping, as the Arizona sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple that she would have normally thought were beautiful. Cole answered on the first ring, his voice deadly calm despite the rage burning inside him like molten iron. "You have something that belongs to me." Raphael tried to project strength, tried to sound like the dangerous cartel lieutenant he was supposed to be, the man who'd earned his nickname by surviving situations that had killed tougher men. "And you've cost us millions, Thompson. Millions of dollars in product, in operations, in infrastructure. Your daughter pays for every dollar you've cost us. El Patron wants you to understand that actions have consequences." But Cole's response carried a coldness that made Raphael's hands start to shake, despite his attempts to maintain control. "I've cost you millions, Raphael? I haven't even started. This has been me being patient. This has been me being reasonable. You have 1 hour to deliver my daughter to the coordinates I'm sending. After that, I stop being surgical and start collecting bodies. Every hour she's not back, 10 of your people die. Every tear on her face, I burn another operation to the ground. You took my baby girl, Raphael. That means you already lost this war. You just don't know it yet. You're already dead. You just haven't stopped breathing. But that's going to change very soon unless my daughter is standing in front of me in 60 minutes. Raphael stared at his phone after the line went dead, watching the coordinates appear on his screen with a little pin marking the location. It was an abandoned gas station 20 miles outside Phoenix, right on the border between Arizona and Mexico, in an area so remote that screams wouldn't carry to anyone who might care. Perfect for an ambush, perfect for a trap, if he'd been the hunter in this situation. But as he looked around the warehouse at his remaining men, their faces pale with barely contained panic and sweat despite the cooling evening air, Raphael realized the terrible truth that his dying brother had tried to warn him about. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He hadn't been the hunter since the moment he'd authorized Lily's kidnapping. Somewhere in the last 18 hours, without him even realizing it was happening, he'd become the prey. And Cole, Razor Thompson, was closing in for the kill, backed by an army of brothers who would ride through hell itself for one of their own, for family, for a child who represented everything they claimed to stand for. Carlos Mendoza's doctor at the hospital in Hermosillo had given him 48 hours to live, maybe less if his condition deteriorated. The injuries from the crash were too severe, too catastrophic for even the best surgeons to repair. The internal bleeding was too extensive, the brain damage too profound, the shattered bones too numerous to count. They were keeping him comfortable with morphine, but everyone knew it was just a matter of time now. Raphael sat at his brother's bedside, holding a hand that felt too cold, too fragile, like it might break if he squeezed too hard. Medical equipment beeped and hummed around them, monitoring a life that was slipping away minute by minute. Carlos managed to open his eyes, managed to focus on his older brother's face despite the drugs and the pain and the damage that was killing him from the inside out. "Let her go," Carlos whispered, each word clearly causing him agony as his broken ribs shifted. "Let the girl go, Raphael. Please. This isn't about business anymore. This is about a father and his daughter. You can't win this fight. Nobody can win this fight. Raphael wanted to argue, wanted to explain about honor and respect and everything the cartel had taught them since they were teenagers desperate to escape poverty. He wanted to talk about loyalty to El Patron and what happened to people who showed weakness in their world. But looking into his brother's dying eyes, eyes that had seen so much violence and caused so much pain, but now only showed regret and fear for what was coming, Raphael saw only truth. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd taken an innocent child to make a point about power and respect, and now they would pay a price that no amount of money or influence could cover. The Hell's Angels weren't just destroying their operations. They were systematically dismantling everything the Águila cartel had built over decades, and they were doing it with a precision that suggested this was just the beginning. Lily heard the engines first, a low rumble in the distance that grew and grew until it felt like the whole world was shaking. Through the grimy warehouse windows, she could see headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. But these weren't the normal headlights of cars or trucks. These were motorcycle headlights, dozens of them, no, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. They formed a perfect circle around the building, a ring of chrome and steel and leather that promised violence on a scale she couldn't fully comprehend, even though she'd grown up around her father's club. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a symphony of engines that spoke of power and fury and absolute determination. Raphael grabbed his gun with shaking hands that could barely hold the weapon, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake on a level that went beyond intellectual comprehension. He hadn't just kidnapped a biker's daughter. He'd taken the child of a man who commanded the loyalty of thousands of brothers across multiple states, men willing to die for the code they lived by, for the family they'd chosen, for a principle that went deeper than any law or any amount of money. The war was about to reach its bloody conclusion, and Raphael knew with absolute certainty that he'd already lost. The question now wasn't whether he would survive, but whether he could save any of his men from the slaughter that was about to unfold. Cole Thompson stepped off his Harley, his boots crunching on the desert gravel of the abandoned gas station, with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence as 2,047 engines shut off simultaneously. Behind him, stretching into the darkness as far as anyone could see, Hell's Angels members formed a wall of leather and steel that represented chapters from California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and even a few brothers who'd ridden up from Mexico itself. Some had ridden for 18 hours straight without stopping except for gas. Some had left their families, their jobs, their entire lives without hesitation the moment they got the code black alert. Some were men he knew well, brothers he'd ridden with for years. Some were strangers who'd never met him but had come anyway because that's what the patch on their backs meant. Because when a brother's daughter was taken, when family was threatened, nothing else mattered. Tommy Reaper Sullivan stood at Cole's right hand, his scarred face set in an expression of controlled fury. Jake Madman Chen stood at his left, his military training evident in his stance and the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats. Behind them, vice presidents and road captains from a dozen different chapters formed the front line of an army that law enforcement had been trying to suppress for decades, but had never truly understood. This wasn't about drugs or territory or criminal enterprise. This was about something far older and more powerful than any of that. This was about family. This was about a code that said you protected your own no matter the cost. This was about a father who would burn the world to ashes to get his daughter back, and an entire brotherhood that would hand him the matches. Raphael emerged from the warehouse with Lily held in front of him, the barrel of his gun pressed against her small head. His remaining 5 men flanked him, their weapons drawn but their hands shaking so badly that they could barely aim. The standoff had begun, and everyone present knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended with a tearful reunion or with blood soaking into the desert sand. Cole's eyes locked onto his daughter, taking in every detail with the desperate intensity of a man who'd been terrified he'd never see her again. She was alive. She was conscious. She appeared unhurt except for the tear stains on her cheeks and the terror in her eyes. That was enough. That was everything. But his expression didn't change, didn't soften, remained as cold and hard as the desert rock beneath their feet. "Let her go, Raphael," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them in the desert silence. "Let her go, and you walk away. You and your men get in your vehicles and you drive across that border and you never come back. That's the deal. That's the only deal you're getting tonight." Raphael laughed, but it was a desperate sound without any real humor. "You think I'm stupid, Thompson? You think I'm going to believe that you'll just let us walk away after everything that's happened? After we took your daughter? After all the damage you've done to our operations?" Cole's response was simple and absolute. "I think you're going to give me back my daughter and then you're going to pray that I'm a man of my word. Because if you're not holding my daughter in the next 30 seconds, if that gun is still pointed at her head, then there is no deal. Then 2,000 bikers are going to tear you apart, and I'm going to make sure you live long enough to regret every second of the last 18 hours. The young guard, the one who'd looked guilty and brought Lily water, suddenly stepped away from the group. His weapon clattered to the ground as he raised his hands in surrender, tears streaming down his face as he spoke rapidly in Spanish. Raphael shouted at him, called him a traitor and a coward, but the young man kept backing away until he was clear of the group. "I didn't sign up for this," he said in heavily accented English. "I didn't sign up to hurt children. This is wrong. This has always been wrong." Two more of Raphael's men looked at each other, had some kind of silent conversation, and lowered their weapons as well. They'd done the math. They'd seen the thousands of bikers surrounding them. They'd realized that loyalty to a cartel that treated them as expendable was worth less than their lives. Raphael's last two loyalists kept their weapons trained on the bikers, but even they looked uncertain now, glancing between their boss and the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Cole took a single step forward, just one, but it was enough to make Raphael flinch. "Last chance, Raphael. Give me my daughter." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Raphael's finger tightened on the trigger. Lily squeezed her eyes shut, remembering her father's promise that he would always come for her. And then Raphael's shoulders sagged in defeat. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pull that trigger and kill a child, even knowing what it would cost him. Whatever he'd become in the cartel, whatever violence he'd committed in the name of business and survival, he couldn't cross that final line. He lowered the gun slowly and released Lily, giving her a gentle push toward her father. Lily ran. She ran faster than she'd ever run in her 8 years of life, her unicorn pajamas flapping as her bare feet hit the desert ground. She ran into her father's arms and he caught her, lifting her up and holding her so tightly that she could barely breathe. But she didn't care because she was safe now. She was home. Cole buried his face in her hair, his whole body shaking with relief and residual fear and rage that was slowly beginning to ebb. "I've got you, baby girl," he whispered over and over again. "Daddy's got you. You're safe now. I've got you." Bloco 3/3, aproximadamente 3,000 palabras. Raphael Mendoza stood in the middle of the desert, surrounded by 2,000 Hell's Angels whose engines had fallen silent but whose presence felt like a living, breathing threat. His gun hung loosely at his side now, the weight of it suddenly meaningless. His two remaining loyal men still had their weapons raised, but their hands were shaking so badly that they couldn't have hit anything even if they tried. The young guard who'd surrendered first was on his knees 20 feet away, hands behind his head, sobbing openly as the reality of what they'd done finally crashed down on him. Raphael watched Cole Thompson hold his daughter, watched the way the hardened criminal's entire body trembled with relief and residual terror, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Deep, crushing shame that made him want to sink into the desert sand and disappear. Tommy Reaper Sullivan stepped forward, his hand resting on the weapon tucked into his belt, his eyes scanning Raphael and his men with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen combat and knew how to evaluate threats. "We had a deal, Razor," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the desert stillness. "The girl for their lives." They walk away. Several of the angels behind them stirred, muttering disagreement. One voice called out, "They took a kid, man. They don't deserve to walk." Another shouted, "Make them pay for what they did." The rumble of agreement that followed suggested that most of the assembled brothers felt the same way. These were men who lived by a code that said you protected children above everything else, and the Aguila cartel had violated that code in the worst possible way. Cole lifted his head from where he'd been holding Lily, his face wet with tears he hadn't known he was crying. He looked at Raphael, really looked at him for the first time since this nightmare had begun 18 hours earlier. What he saw wasn't the monster he'd been imagining, the faceless evil that had taken his daughter. What he saw was a broken man whose own brother was dying in a hospital because of a decision Cole himself had made when his club ambushed that convoy. He saw someone who was trapped in the same cycle of violence and retribution that had defined Cole's entire adult life. He saw someone who could have pulled that trigger, could have killed Lily out of desperation or spite or fear, but hadn't. That had to count for something. That had to matter. "They walk," Cole said, his voice hoarse but firm. The murmuring behind him grew louder, more protests, more calls for justice and revenge. Jake, Madman Chen, stepped forward, his military bearing evident in every movement. "Razor, brother, I respect you more than any man alive, but these people took Lily. They terrorized her. They made her think she was going to die, and you want to just let them walk away?" Cole understood the objection, understood the anger and the desire for retribution because he felt it himself burning like acid in his chest. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to give the order, to let his brothers tear these men apart, to make Raphael suffer in ways that would haunt his nightmares if he survived long enough to have nightmares. But Lily was trembling in his arms, her small body pressed against his chest, and he could feel her heart racing. She'd been through enough. She'd seen enough violence and fear to last a lifetime. If he gave the order now, if he let this turn into a massacre in front of her, she would never forget it. She would carry that image for the rest of her life, would always remember that her father had killed men while holding her. And more than that, more than protecting her innocence, Cole realized something that cut through his rage like a knife. If he killed Raphael now, some other brother or cousin or son would feel justified in retaliating against him or his club, or maybe even against Lily herself when she was older. The cycle would never end. The violence would just keep spiraling until everyone he loved was dead or destroyed. "They walk," Cole repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying authority that made the protests die down. "We came here for one thing. To get my daughter back. That's done. That's finished. Raphael, you and your men get in your vehicles, and you drive south. You cross that border and you never come back. You tell El Patron and everyone else in your organization that the Hell's Angels are done with this war, but if anyone from the Aguila cartel ever comes near my family again, if I even hear a rumor about retaliation, then what happened today will look like mercy compared to what comes next. We destroyed 15 of your operations in 18 hours. Imagine what we'll do if you give us a real reason to commit." Raphael nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to speak. He gestured to his remaining men, and they began backing toward their vehicles, weapons still drawn but pointed at the ground now. The young guard who'd surrendered was allowed to stand, and he stumbled toward the trucks on legs that barely held him up. As Raphael climbed into the driver's seat of his SUV, he looked back one final time at Cole Thompson holding his daughter. Their eyes met across the desert darkness, and some understanding passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. They were both trapped in a world where violence begat violence, where every action demanded a reaction, where showing weakness meant death. But tonight, for reasons neither of them could fully articulate, they were choosing to step off that treadmill. The cartel vehicles kicked up dust as they drove away into the Mexican darkness, taillights disappearing into the night like dying embers. The assembled Hell's Angels watched them go, engines still silent, the tension slowly beginning to bleed out of the air. Cole felt Lily shift in his arms and realized she was watching the vehicles disappear too. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice small and frightened in a way that broke his heart. "Are they going to come back?" He held her tighter, his hand cradling the back of her head like he used to do when she was a baby. "No, baby girl. They're not coming back. I promise. You're safe now. You're always going to be safe." Sarah appeared from one of the support vehicles that had been hanging back, Agent Rodriguez beside her. Sarah was crying openly as she ran toward them, her professional composure completely gone. Cole carefully passed Lily to her mother, watching as Sarah clutched their daughter and sank to her knees in the desert sand, sobbing with relief. Agent Rodriguez approached Cole slowly, her expression unreadable in the darkness. "That was either the smartest thing you've ever done or the dumbest," she said quietly, her voice pitched so only he could hear. "Time will tell which." Cole nodded, too exhausted to care what law enforcement thought about his choices. "My daughter is safe. That's all that matters." Tommy approached and put a hand on Cole's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "You did good, brother." That took more balls than killing them would have taken. Jake nodded his agreement, though his military mind was clearly still processing the tactical implications of letting enemies walk away. "The men aren't all happy about it, Razor. Some of them rode 18 hours to get here for a fight." Cole looked out at the assembled brothers, at the army that had responded to his call without hesitation, and felt something close to awe at the power of the bonds they'd forged. "Tell them I said thank you. Tell them their president knows he asked a lot and they delivered everything. The debt is mine, and I won't forget it." 3 months later, Lily sat in her third-grade classroom working on a drawing for art class. Her teacher had asked the students to draw something that made them feel safe. While the other kids drew pictures of their houses or their pets or their families, Lily drew something different. She drew a circle of motorcycles surrounding a small figure in the middle, and she colored each motorcycle carefully with crayons, making some red and some black and some with chrome that she represented with silver marker. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, looked at the drawing with concern etched on her face. "Lily, honey, can you tell me about your picture?" Lily looked up with a smile that was more confident than it had been 3 months ago, though her therapist said the nightmares were still happening several times a week. "That's me in the middle," Lily explained, pointing to the small figure. "And those are my dad's friends all around me, keeping me safe. Because that's what family does. They protect each other." Mrs. Patterson wanted to ask more questions, wanted to probe deeper into what experiences had led to this particular vision of safety, but something in Lily's expression made her hesitate. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "That's a very powerful picture, Lily. You're a very talented artist." When Cole came to pick Lily up that Friday for their weekend together, Mrs. Patterson mentioned the drawing. Cole looked at it for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed the image, and then he carefully rolled it up to take home. "Thank you for sharing this with me," he said quietly. Raphael Mendoza sat in a cantina in Hermosillo, nursing a beer that had gone warm an hour ago. His brother, Carlos, had died 2 days after they'd released Lily Thompson, slipping away in his sleep with Raphael holding his hand and whispering apologies that could never be enough. El Patron had been surprisingly understanding about the entire situation, perhaps because the Hell's Angels had cost them so much money that continuing the war would have been financial suicide, or perhaps because even cartel leaders understood that some lines, once crossed, changed everything. Raphael had been reassigned to lower-level operations, a demotion that everyone understood was merciful under the circumstances. He should have been killed for the failure. Instead, he was given a chance to rebuild his reputation slowly, carefully, without the kind of high-stakes operations that had led to disaster. The young guard who'd surrendered that night had disappeared, probably fled to the United States to start over somewhere far from the border. The other two men who'd lowered their weapons had been absorbed into different cells, their moment of pragmatic cowardice quietly forgotten as the organization moved forward. Raphael thought about that night constantly, replayed it in his mind during the long hours when sleep wouldn't come. He thought about the moment when his finger had been on the trigger, when he'd had the power to end that little girl's life. He thought about why he hadn't pulled it, what had stopped him when every instinct of self-preservation had been screaming that killing the hostage was his only leverage. He didn't have a good answer, not one that made sense in the world he inhabited. All he knew was that he'd looked into Lily Thompson's terrified eyes and seen his own niece, the daughter of his dead sister, and he couldn't do it. Cole Thompson sat in his apartment on a Friday night, watching Lily sleep in the bedroom he'd decorated with her favorite purple curtains and stuffed animals that lined every available surface. She'd moved in with him full-time 2 months ago, Sarah having made the difficult decision that Lily would be safer with her father, protected by the club, than in a normal suburban house where anyone could kick down the door. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The courts had taken custody away from Cole because his lifestyle was too dangerous, and now that same dangerous lifestyle was the only thing keeping his daughter safe. Agent Rodriguez had arranged for regular protection, unmarked cars that did drive-bys several times a day, but everyone knew the real deterrent was the Hells Angels patch and what it represented. The nightmares were getting better, the therapist said. Lily was processing the trauma in healthy ways, talking about her feelings, drawing pictures that helped her make sense of what had happened. But Cole knew she'd never fully forget those 18 hours, knew that somewhere deep inside his little girl was a wound that would probably never completely heal. That knowledge sat on his chest like a weight every single day, a reminder of the cost of the life he'd chosen. He'd tried to walk away from the club 2 years ago, had tried to go legitimate and build a different future for himself and his daughter. But the club had pulled him back, or maybe he'd never really left. And now, here they were. Tommy stopped by around 9, letting himself in with the key Cole had given him. He found his president sitting in the dark, nursing a beer and staring at nothing. "You good, brother?" Tommy asked, settling into the other chair. Cole nodded slowly. "Just thinking. About choices and consequences and whether any of it matters." Tommy was quiet for a moment, understanding that this was one of those conversations that happened sometimes between brothers who'd known each other long enough to be honest. "You saved her, Razor. You got her back. That's what matters. The rest is just noise." But Cole wasn't sure it was that simple. He'd gotten Lily back, yes, but at what cost? 15 cartel operations destroyed. Millions of dollars in damage. Who knew how many people had lost their jobs or their livelihoods when those operations burned? The violence had stopped, the war had ended, but the consequences rippled outward in ways he couldn't fully track or understand. "I let them walk, Tommy. I let the men who took my daughter just drive away. Some of the brothers still don't understand that. Still think I went soft." Tommy shook his head firmly. "You did the hardest thing, brother. You chose to break the cycle instead of continuing it. That's not soft. That's the strongest thing I've ever seen." 6 months after that night in the desert, Agent Maria Rodriguez submitted a report to her superiors that would never be made public. In it, she detailed the systematic destruction of the Águila cartel's operations across 5 states, the unprecedented mobilization of outlaw motorcycle clubs in response to a threat against one of their own, and the surprising restraint shown by Cole Thompson when he had every opportunity and justification for revenge. Her report concluded with a recommendation that surprised even her as she typed it. Subject: Thompson demonstrated tactical sophistication and strategic thinking beyond what we typically associate with outlaw motorcycle clubs. More significantly, he demonstrated the ability to prioritize his daughter's well-being over personal vengeance, choosing to end a cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it. While his organization remains criminal in nature, this incident suggests a capacity for rational decision-making that could potentially be leveraged in future negotiations or de-escalation efforts. Her supervisor read the report twice, made some notes in the margins, and filed it away in a database that would probably never be accessed. But Agent Rodriguez kept a copy for herself, a reminder that the world wasn't as simple as good guys and bad guys, that sometimes the criminals made better choices than the system expected, and that mercy could be more powerful than vengeance. 1 year after her kidnapping, Lily Thompson stood on a stage at her elementary school receiving a certificate for bravery as part of a school-wide assembly about courage. The principal had no idea why she'd been selected by her teacher, didn't know the real story behind the quiet 9-year-old who'd somehow earned this recognition. Lily accepted the certificate with a small smile, and when she returned to her seat, she looked out at the audience where her father sat in the back row. Cole Thompson, vice president of the Phoenix chapter of the Hells Angels, wearing his colors proudly, tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter receive recognition for surviving something that would have broken most adults. After the assembly, as they walked to his truck, Lily slipped her small hand into his much larger one. "Daddy, do you think about that night a lot?" she asked, her voice curious rather than frightened. Cole considered lying, considered protecting her from the truth, but decided she deserved better than that. "Every day, baby girl. Every single day." She nodded, processing this information with the seriousness that trauma had forced upon her too early. "Me too. But you know what? I'm not as scared anymore. Because I know that no matter what happens, you'll always come for me. You and Uncle Tommy and Uncle Jake and all the other brothers. That's what family means, right?" Cole stopped walking and knelt down so he was eye level with his daughter. "That's exactly what family means, Lily. And I will always, always come for you. That's a promise I made the day you were born, and it's a promise I'll keep until the day I die." She hugged him then, her small arms wrapping around his neck, and Cole held his daughter in the parking lot of her elementary school and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not for himself, maybe, but for her. Hope that she would grow up strong and brave, that she would learn from what had happened without being destroyed by it, that she would understand that family and loyalty and love were worth fighting for. Their story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose to break cycles of violence rather than perpetuate them. It's a story about the lengths a father will go to protect his child, about the power of brotherhood and loyalty, and about the courage it takes to choose mercy over vengeance when everything in your world tells you that revenge is the only answer. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the complex choices that define us in our darkest moments. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose a different path, to break the cycle, to prioritize love over hatred. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters. Not the violence or the revenge or the endless cycle of retribution, but the choices we make when we're given the chance to choose differently.